Ja, guten Abend. Freut mich sehr, dass Sie da sind zu unserer 6. Boeckh Lecture, wenn ich richtig gezählt habe. Es sind genügend Leute im Saal, die mich korrigieren können. Unser Gast ist heute Professor Tim Whitmarsh. Der ist hier, der steht dort. Er ist nach Professuren in Oxford und Exeter seit 2014 Leventis Professor of Greek Culture an der Cambridge University. Doch bevor ich ihn näher vorstelle, möchte ich mich nochmal ganz herzlich bei Martin Stöckinger bedanken, unserem neuen Koordinator, der die Vorbereitung dieses Vortrags hervorragend in die Hand genommen hat, und unsere 2 neuen studentischen Hilfskräfte, Frau Neuenfeld und Herr Londa, die Nachfolger, die sind schon geflüchtet, die Nachfolger der legendären 2 Österreicher angetreten haben. Nun zur Vorstellung unseres Redners. Tim Whitmarsh treibt seit dem Erscheinen seines ersten Buchs, 2001 erschienen, Greek Literature and the Roman Empire, quasi im Alleingang die Forschung zur kaiserzeitlichen griechischen Literatur voran. Ich erwähne nur die beiden Bücher zu Narrative and Identity in the Ancient Greek Novel, 2011 erschienen, und Beyond the Second Sophistic, 2013. Eine neue Monographie zum antiken Atheismus ist für 2015 angekündigt. Ganz besonders herausheben möchte ich seine Literaturgeschichte, Ancient Greek Literature, 2004 erschienen, die einen dezidiert problemorientierten Kurs verfolgt und schon so manchen Leser vor der neopositivistischen Namens- und Datenflut anderer Literaturgeschichten gerettet hat. Zu diesen Monographien kommen viele Sammelbände. Ich nenne nur 3, die in Berlin viel gelesen werden, weil sie mit unserem Lieblingsthema Knowledge zu tun haben. Ordering Knowledge in the Roman Empire, 2007, Galen and the World of Knowledge, 2009 und Local Knowledge and Micro-Identities in the Greek-Roman World. Auch Micro-Identities sind natürlich ein wichtiges Thema in Berlin, aber es steht auf einem anderen Blatt. Alle diese Bücher haben viel dafür getan, Theorieansätze in unser Feld hineinzutragen und nicht zuletzt dazu, sich überhaupt mit zeitgenössischen Kulturtheorien im Hinblick auf die alte Welt auseinanderzusetzen. The Roman Greek World ist in jedem Fall das Feld, in dem Tim Whitmarsh derzeit die prominenteste Stimme ist. Für uns ist das Selbstverständnis der griechischen Intellektuellen in der Kaiserzeit ein Rätsel, in dem wir auch immer wieder in solchen Kategorien wie Widerstand oder Kollaboration denken. Und die Frage ist natürlich vollkommen berechtigt, ob diese Kategorien irgendwie historisch sachhaltig sind. Wir sind deshalb besonders froh, dass Tim Whitmarsh einen Vortrag präsentieren wird, in dem es um einen Kernbereich der intellektuellen griechisch-römischen Beziehungen gehen wird, nämlich die Geschichtsschreibung. Welche sind die Formen, in denen ein griechischer Geschichtsschreiber die Romanisierung der Welt beschreibt? Gibt es Möglichkeiten, sich als griechischer Intellektueller gegen die römische Sicht der Dinge zur Wehr zu setzen? Das und zweifellos noch vieles andere wird uns Tim Whitmarsh hoffentlich in seinem Vortrag verraten. Sein Titel ist History, Chance and Literary Resistance to the Roman Empire. Ich bitte Sie, Herrn Whitmarsh, mit einem kräftigen Applaus zu empfangen.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and it's a great honor to be here. Intellectual resistance to the Roman rule is hard to find. Harold Fuchs' book on the topic, Der geistige Widerstand gegen Rom, is a mere 24 pages long. The footnotes take up 3 times as much as the main text. As you might expect from a left-leaning German writing in the 1930s, it places its primary emphasis on Jewish resistance, which is no doubt a special case. The 1987 Entretien de la Fondation Art volume on opposition and resistance to the Roman Empire from Augustus to Trajan, meanwhile, focuses almost entirely on military and political opposition, such as it was. In any search for resistance, we might be ultimately led to wonder instead, with Clifford Ando, at the empire's seemingly unnatural ability to conjure not resistance but consensus. Was it the case, then, that there was no non-Jewish intellectuals resisting Rome? Now, in an earlier paper, which was published in a different Fondation Art volume, I argued that we shouldn't be looking for explicit statements of opposition, but for what I called discursive resistance. A number of Greek writers, I claimed, used various kinds of symbol or trope to capture the struggle with Rome allegorically. Space, for example, can be figured politically, Pausanias's sacred interiors can be imagined as protected by divine powers from external influence. Or the empire can be thought of as a delimited space on the Earth's surface, so that beyond borders becomes a location for discursive resistance. So, for example, Apollonius of Tyana travels to the edges of the Roman Empire and then beyond into a space beyond Roman rule. Or, alternatively, the resistance of the human body to torture can be seen as an expression of resistance to tyrannical power of the kind that Rome might be seen to impose. But stories like this are subtle, covert, muted. Is there a genuine, explicit resistance to Roman rule? Now, I argue in this paper that references in Augustan literature seem to suggest that there were writers, now unfortunately lost, who composed such powerfully anti-Roman discourse. In this paper, I want to consider an individual case, Metrodorus of Skepsis, and push the evidence for his thoughts as far as I can. This will, of course, involve a certain amount of guesswork and hypothesis, but even if there can be no certainty in these matters, I hope to show you that it's highly likely that something like my reconstruction of Metrodorus' thoughts was in circulation, and indeed was the focus for an overtly hostile resistance to Rome. Now let's begin with what, as we'll see, is the most important evidence for Metrodorus. This comes in the prologue to Dionysius of Halicarnassus' Roman Antiquities, published in 7 BCE. This is the long passage which you have on the handout, and I'll treat it in some detail. The important section is the final one, but the surrounding parts are also indispensable for reasons that I'll make clear soon. Now, Dionysius' primary aim in this introduction is to justify his choice of topic, which is the early history of Rome. The early history of Rome, he says, will be unpromising to some. In the course of making this claim, he sketches out possible alternative models for the historiography of Rome, and it's on one of these I'll be focusing. So, as I say, we'll go through the passage slowly, ignoring the numbers encircled for now. Before I proceed, Dionysius says, I desire to show in a few words that it's not without design and mature premeditation that I've turned to the early part of Rome's history, but that I've well considered reasons to give for my choice, to forestall the censure of those who, fond of finding fault with everything, and not as yet having heard any of the matters which I'm about to make known, may blame me, because, in spite of the fact that this city, grown so famous in our days, had very humble and inglorious beginnings, unworthy of historical record, and that it was but a few generations ago, that is, since her overthrow of the Macedonian powers and her success in the Punic Wars, that she arrived at distinction and glory. This is a very long sentence, I apologize for this. Nevertheless, when I was at liberty to choose one of the famous periods in her history for my theme, I turned aside to one so barren of distinction as her antiquarian lore. So as I say, very long sentence, but essentially what he's saying here is simply that his choice of subject matter may appear unpromising to some, in the sense that Rome's successes were post-Macedonian wars, whereas he's dealing with the early history. So to continue, for to this day, he says, almost all of the Greeks are ignorant of the early history of Rome, and the great majority of them have been imposed upon by sundry false opinions, grounded upon stories which chance has brought to their ears. And they've been led to believe that having come upon various vagabonds without house or home, and barbarians, and even those not free men as her founders, she in the course of time arrived at world domination, and that this, not through reverence for the gods and injustice and every other virtue, but through some chance and the injustice of fortune, which inconsiderately showers her greatest fortunes upon the most undeserving. And indeed, the more malicious are wont to rail openly at fortune for freely bestowing on the basest of barbarians the blessings of the Greeks. And yet, he says, why should I mention men at large, when even some historians have dared to express such views in the writings they've left, taking this method of humouring barbarian kings who detested Rome's supremacy, princes to whom they were ever servilely devoted, and with whom they associated as flatterers, by presenting them with histories in inverted commas, which were neither just nor true. As I say, a very long passage, and I'll come back to this on several occasions, so don't worry now if we haven't fully divined the meaning of it. Now, formally, this is a passage of a very familiar kind. From Aristophanes' Parabases through Callimachus' Aitia prologue and beyond, Greek authors had positioned themselves against potential critics who may or may not be straw men. Critics that they preempted as a means, of course, of advertising their own talents. When Dionysius says there may be people criticizing him, he's also singularly advertising the powers of historiography. In history, of course, Thucydides had also conceded that his work might be thought of as a less than pleasant read because of the absence of to mythodes, the mythic, or whatever that phrase means. The closest parallel, in fact, of which I know to Dionysius' ironical deprecation of his subject matter, comes in a later text, Tacitus' Annals, where the Roman author, in their famous historiographical digression of Book 4 of his Annals, begs his readers not to compare his own depressing subject matter with the glories of early Rome. So Tacitus does it the other way around. Tacitus says, I apologize for talking of things that may not seem very interesting of the modern era, whereas in fact the earlier material was more interesting. So yes, Dionysius' self-positioning in this passage is a rhetorically constructed topos. The opponents that he has concocted are there in order to demonstrate through inversion what his own priorities are. But let's dig a little deeper into these priorities. I want to take now, in turn, each of his 5 categories of professed opponents and consider what he's objecting to in each case. I've listed these on the handout under number 3, but it may be easier for you to use the first passage. This is what the circled numbers are doing on that first passage. Each of the circled numbers refers to an opponent or a set of opponents that Dionysius is referring to. So the first category of people that he is objecting to are the philaitioi, those who like finding fault with everything. He says, I'm acting so as to forestall the censure, the attack, the criticism of those who, fond of finding fault with everything, may blame me. Now, I'd like to think, as an aside, that Dionysius' use of philaitios here may be alluding to Callimachus' Aitia, and in particular to the opening attack on the censorious Telchines. But we leave that aside. The important point is that these philaitioi, these people fond of criticism, are imagined as objecting on the basis of unpromising subject matter. Rome, they say, has only recently risen to power in the aftermath of the Punic and Macedonian wars. Early Rome, in their estimation, is unworthy of historical record. Uc axias historicaires anagraphaires. Now that objection is countered by reference to the second group of opponents, the ignorant Greeks, those who are amongst the Greeks who are still ignorant of early Roman history. Their ignorance is assumed to explain, that's the role of the gar there, what we are now to take as the false view that early Roman history is lacking in interest. Now, the ignorance of the second group is compounded by a third group of opponents, the spreaders of false opinion. This is where we begin to get a little bit more substance about what might be going on in these alternative histories of Rome. There are 2 aspects to the false opinions spread about Rome. The first is that the early Romans were low-grade, déclassé individuals. What Dionysius writes is various vagabonds without house or home, and barbarians, and not even those free men. This emphasis on low social status perhaps retrospectively explains the objections of opponents. One, that Rome had very humble and inglorious beginnings, adoxus kai panu tapenas. Tapenos, in particular, can imply low social class. So that's the first objection of these people that spread false rumors about early Rome. The second form of false rumor is that the Romans acquired the empire they now have not by merit, but by accident, by chance. What Dionysius writes is not through reverence for the gods and justice and every other virtue, arete, but through some chance and the injustice of fortune. Presumably, the argument that we must reconstruct goes that the original Romans were low-status individuals, so therefore their successors are constitutionally incapable of morally proper action, because as we all know, people of low social status can't act morally. The Roman Empire, then, must have been acquired not through virtue, because they had no virtue, but accidentally. The fourth group of opponents are the kakoerthes, the malicious, or more strictly, the more malicious. We're to assume that all of the previous groups are malicious themselves, but the fourth group are even more malicious, kakoerthestroi. There's a reasonable chance that charges of malice were in fact commonly levelled by historians against other historians. Malicious history is the opposite of flattering history, and both are warped by their own subjectivity. Both imply the historian invests too much in the story that they're telling. We might think of Tacitus's claim to write sine ira et studio, with neither anger nor zeal, at the beginning of his histories. What Tacitus is saying there is, neither am I promoting one group, nor am I attacking another. I'm following an objective middle course between the two. So malice in history is an important dimension. And we remember, of course, Plutarch's essay on the malice of Herodotus, and that's the same word, kakoertheia. Now, malicious writers of early history of Rome, or oral historians perhaps of early history of Rome, according to Dionysius, give a specific role to fortune, tucher. They make open accusations against her on the grounds that she's diverted onto the basest of the barbarians, again this emphasis on low social class, the success, the agatha, that properly belongs to the Greeks. Now, this reference to the baseness of the Romans, as I say, continues the thread suggesting that the low social standing of the early Romans has contributed to their immoral behavior while acquiring their empire. So the fourth group of opponents accentuate two themes that have been only implicit so far. Firstly, that history is a narrative and conveys an ethical point. It's not simply about recording the facts of the past. History tells a story with ethical purpose to it. And the second point is that history is always told from one particular vantage, and in particular, one particular cultural vantage. That's to say, from Greek or Roman perspective. And it can be used to promote the history of that culture. The fifth and final group of opponents are the court historians of Rome's enemies. Dionysius writes of some historians taking this method of humouring barbarian kings who detested Rome's supremacy. Now, here we see the flip side of historical malice. These historians are not writing out of malice to attack Rome, necessarily, but more out of flattery towards foreign kings. So Dionysius sets himself against 5 formally distinct groups of opponents, whose views seem to be nevertheless interconnected and coherent with each other. The opposing view of Rome as a whole seems to be that, firstly, the earliest Romans were socially low-class individuals. Secondly, congruently with their base origins, the actions of Romans were characteristically morally base as well. Thirdly, that their empire was acquired relatively recently by chance, not as a result of any merit or virtue on their part. And fourthly, that if fortune had rewarded the just, then it would be a Greek empire rather than a Roman one. Now, because what Dionysius describes in the entirety of this passage seems to be a coherent position, I'm going to make 2 assumptions. The first is that all of the anti-Roman claims in this passage interlock, and whilst they're presented cumulatively, they in fact describe a single position. Dionysius has identified different groups of opponents, but in fact the case is cumulative and crescendo-like. Each new set of opponents adds more outrageous misrepresentation to the previous one's view of Rome. But they're all saying the same thing. Now, if this is true, then we must conclude that the inhabitants of the fifth and final category, that's to say, the court historians of the barbarian king, have put the argument in the most complete and, from Dionysius' point of view, the most reprehensible form. They are therefore Dionysius' real targets. So that's my first assumption. My second assumption is that the fifth category, the court historians, are a real group, and they're not simply rhetorically constructed straw men. Categories 1 to 4 may well be invented ones, or at least vague and non-individualized, but the location of these historians in the courts of barbarian kings who hate Rome's supremacy looks far too specific to be made up. This is not a topos, as far as I know. I can't think of any other passage in Greek or Latin literature up until this period that refers to Greek historians located in a barbarian court. So it seems highly likely that Dionysius has real people in mind here. So who might these historians be? Who might the barbarian kings be? Scholars who have commentated on this passage, and there are not many, have proposed two candidates. One is Timagenes of Alexandria, the other is Metrodorus of Skepsis. Now, Timagenes cannot be right. He was known as an anti-Roman historian, certainly, and he was an approximate contemporary of Dionysius's, but his works were in fact composed at Rome, not a foreign court. Metrodorus is, however, an interesting possibility. Born in the 140s BCE, he was a brilliant orator and stylist who invented a sophisticated mnemonic technique. And crucially, he ended up in the court of Mithridates VI, Eupator, Rome's rival for dominance in Asia Minor and the Eastern Mediterranean in the early 1st century BCE. Metrodorus was the starriest in a circle of Greek intellectuals at Mithridates' court, a circle that included Aesopus, Heraclides of Magnesia, and Teucrus of Cyzicus. Metrodorus is known to us primarily as an orator and philosopher. He invented, as I say, this prodigious system of remembering things in the mind. But we do have one title, securely attested, that may fit the billing for an alternative account of Rome's history. This is a text called On History, to which a scholiast on Apollonius of Rhodes refers for information on marine marvels. Now, Metrodorus died in about 70 BCE as a result of an intrigue involving the Armenian king Tigranes, so he was dead for some period by this time. Now, Metrodorus was certainly associated with anti-Roman prejudice, as you can see from passages under number 4 on the handout. The Ovid passage is particularly interesting, as there are some apparent parallels with our Dionysius preface. Note that Ovid describes the man of Skepsis that he refers to there as attacking Roman customs with bitter screeds and a savage tongue, which perhaps echoes Dionysius' accusation of malice, kakoertheia. Ovid speaks of the attack as a forensic prosecution. Rome is a rea, a defendant. Similarly, Dionysius speaks of an accusation against fortune, kategorein, when describing the fourth category of opponent. More specifically, Dionysius refers in the last line I've cited to histories that were neither just nor true, dikaios. Again, this suggests that perhaps charges were laid out in a way that resembled a legal prosecution. Finally, Ovid's falsa convicia suggests Dionysius' claim that his historians' accusations were untrue. The emphasis on Ovid's Skepsian, on Roman immorality, also perhaps echoes Dionysius' third and fourth categories of opponents who claim that Rome doesn't deserve her empire on moral grounds. Given that the Epistulae ex Ponto were written sometime after 8 CE, that's to say a mere 15 or so years after Dionysius published the Antiquities, it seems to my mind highly likely, or at least possible, that both refer to the same person, and that Metrodorus had a reputation in Augustan Rome for writing a work that laid out charges against Roman mores and actions. The Pliny passage I leave aside for now, but we can return to it in questions if you like. Now, enough has been said, I think, to show that Metrodorus is, at the very least, a likely candidate for the role of opponent 5 in Dionysius' prologue. Indeed, it seems to me likely also, although I cannot prove this, that his on history is the sole target, and the plural is an exaggeration. That's to say, Dionysius is referring to one historian rather than many. Now, what did these anti-Roman histories contain? We've already had some ideas, which the Ovid and Pliny passages help us to thicken out. The attack on the morality of Romans and their actions may have been presented in the form of a quasi-legal arraignment, and it may be relevant to note here that amongst other positions, Metrodorus held the role of judge, the most powerful judge in Pontus. It's likely, too, that the account drew on the kinds of stories about early Rome that Metrodorus will have heard. I think more detail can be filled out if we return to the Dionysius passage. Let's pick up some salient features that we haven't addressed yet. Opponents 1 claim that, and here I'm quoting, it was but a few generations ago, that is, since her overthrow of the Macedonian powers and her success in the Punic Wars, that she, Rome, arrived at her distinction and glory. This puts the beginning point of Roman dominance in the 3rd century BCE, so the Punic War, of course, began in 264. This seems to be highly significant, given that any claim to Greek military superiority over Rome will have been built around the figure of Alexander, who died in 323. So I would suspect that the anti-Roman history argued that it was only the death of Alexander that allowed for the Roman victories in the Macedonian Wars and facilitated Rome's rise. Another detail from Dionysius: the founders of Rome are said by opponents too to have been various vagabonds without house or home and barbarians. This surely refers to the story of Romulus's asylum. Dionysius himself knew of this, but he downplays its reference in comparison to Livy, since it doesn't serve his wider agenda of proving that the real Romans are ethnic Greeks. It's likely, then, that Metrodorus' account included anecdotes from the early myth history of Rome, anecdotes, incidentally, that he may have picked up in the Troad. Skepsis is in the Troad, and of course it's from the Troad that the stories emanated detailing Aeneas' migration to Italy. So, yes, as I say, it's likely that Metrodorus' account included anecdotes from the early myth history of Rome. In this connection, I would also highlight the fact that opponents 3 and 4 classify the Romans as barbarians. Dionysius is clearly concerned to counter this, not only by arguing that the Romans are in fact ethnic Greeks, but also by turning the accusation round and levelling and focusing on the barbarian kings with which these alternative historians found shelter. The final point that I cull from Dionysius is the emphasis on chance, to automatismos, and fortune, tucher, mentioned twice. This is surely no accurate. The emphasis is unmissable. Now, there was, of course, a strongly providential strain in pro-Roman writings about the rise of Rome, most visible in Virgil's Aeneid. I set no limits on the Romans' achievements, says Jupiter in the first book of the epic, nor any time frame. I've given them empire without end. Now, Dionysius himself, elsewhere in his histories, never quite says that the Roman Empire is the result of divine orchestration. But the fact that he's seeking to combat those who blame tucher and see the rise of Rome as the result of chance suggests that, as many people have often felt, Dionysius is committing, albeit covertly, to a providential view of the rise of Rome. So did Metrodorus then explicitly argue quite the opposite, that history depends not on providence, but on happenstance? Did he counter the kind of picture that was painted by Polybius about the rise of Rome? He quite possibly did. There were, of course, significant precedents for God-free history, notably in Thucydides' history. What's more, I note in passing that Metrodorus is said to have studied in Athens in his youth at the academy, when he was a student of Carneades and associate of Clytomachus. Now, both of these were instrumental in the codification of philosophical atheism. So it could very well be that Metrodorus was influenced by atheistic arguments circulating in the academy, and that he thereby proposed a new kind of history, one that stressed the absence of benevolent divine influence and the central role of arbitrariness, ho automatismos. Now, there's been a fair amount of speculation in my argument so far, but I hope you will allow me to give that particular screw another turn. Dionysius' contemporary Livy, as is well known, has a digression in Book 9 of Aberbe Condita on the question of whether Alexander would have defeated the Romans had he confronted them. Now, I wish to note merely 2 points about this famous passage. Firstly, Livy also emphasizes the role of fortune on a number of occasions. The passage under number 5 on your handout is but one example. Livy is particularly keen to emphasize that fortune is unpredictably mutable, perhaps because he is countering arguments that center on the question of fortune. And indeed, he is confronting claims coming from the other side, as the second passage shows. Here, Livy famously excoriates the leusimi ex Graecis, the most trivial of the Greeks, who claim that Romans would have given in to Alexander, and that indeed they are inferior to the Parthians. This looks very much like a claim that Roman dominance is due to circumstance rather than innate superiority. Now, it cannot be exactly Metrodorus that Livy is attacking here, because Metrodorus' argument would have been surely that not the Parthians, but that Mithridates and his court would have been the victors of a confrontation with Rome. So the Parthian thing tells us that Livy is not dealing directly with Metrodorus. But that said, this is surely the kind of argument that Metrodorus would have come up with. Now, there's just one last piece of evidence, or rather collection of texts, that can inform our discussion. Let me turn in conclusion to Plutarch's 3 treatises on the fortune or virtue of Alexander 1-2 and on the fortune of the Romans. These are highly suggestive in terms of the themes we've been tracing. The Alexander treatises argue that the Macedonian general achieved everything that he did thanks to virtue rather than good fortune, this opposition that seems so central to Dionysius' prologue. The first of the 2 speeches cast Alexander as a philosopher in action, putting into practice the intellectual principles of Plato and Aristotle. The second, which is much longer, emphasizes Alexander's patronage of others who were artists and philosophers, and reiterates the point that it was virtue rather than fortune that got Alexander where he was. I've quoted a single passage under number 6 on the handout, which makes this point. There are many other passages, but this is exemplary. All the while, which of Alexander's great successes, Plutarch writes, did he get that was not merited, that was not sweated for, that was not bled for? Which came free? So if it were possible to bring forward parousia on behalf of Alexander to counter fortune, as if countering a human being, would she not say, when and where did you make an easy way for Alexander's achievements? Which rock did he ever capture without a bloody assault, thanks to you? Now there is, as I say, a striking parallel here between the argument made about Alexander's achievements and the position sketched out by Dionysius for his opponent in the Roman antiquities. In both, it's a question of merit set against fortune. Alexander, on Plutarch's account, achieved everything thanks to his own intrinsic worth, axia, with fortune, tuche, ranged against him. It's a short step from here to the obvious corollary, which is that Roman imperialism succeeded not through virtue, but through fortune's arbitrary gifts. It seems to me, then, highly likely that Dionysius had an argument something like this in mind when he wrote the preface of the Roman Antiquities. It is a short step, but one that Plutarch actually takes up to a point on the fortune of the Romans. This short text looks as if it's connected to the Alexander speeches, even if there is no explicit link. What this text is about is the relative weight of fortune and virtue in the eventuation of Roman history. It ends, actually, with an extraordinary passage. Here Plutarch imagines Alexander confronting the Romans and wonders what would have happened. So this is the big rhetorical question that everyone wants answered. What would have happened if Alexander had headed west rather than east? So what's Plutarch's answer? Quoting Homer's Odyssey, he comments that, not without the spilling of much blood would this have been settled. And that's it. So after pointing out, there's a little bit more. He points out that the Romans had a lot of soldiers, but then he simply stops. There's no answers to the question that everyone wants. I read this as an act of high-wire tightrope walking on Plutarch's part. He knows that this is a highly contentious issue on which he can't afford to pronounce. The pleasure of reading or listening to this speech comes from our marveling at his ability to stay on the rope without slipping up. So he's deliberately avoiding pronouncing on the issue. But that's not the important point here. The important point for our purposes is that Plutarch's question about chance versus virtue as drivers of history is exactly the theme of Dionysius' preface. Opponents, 3 in particular in Dionysius, argue that Rome's empire has grown not through arete, but through automatismos, through fortune. Plutarch argues that Rome's success is indeed due to tucher, to fortune. But, and this is the crucial turn that Plutarch makes, fortune is now conceived not as random chance, but as providence. So Rome's success is not due to arbitrary happenstance, but to the gods' favour, to divine planning, to providence. Let's look at the passage under number 7 on the handout. When she approached the Palatine, Plutarch says, and she crossed over the Tiber, she, this is fortune, seems to have taken off her wings, stepped out of her sandals, and abandoned her untrustworthy and wobbly globe. Thus did she enter Rome to stay, and that is how she is today. So this is essentially the argument on the fortune of the Romans in a nutshell, that Rome was indeed lucky, but it was a providential kind of luck, of the sort that divine favour alone provides. Exploiting the well-established ambiguity of the Greek word tucher, he argues that it means not arbitrary fortune, but providence, that it shifts semantically when the Romans gain their empire. Indeed, it is On the Fortune of the Romans that Plutarch makes his famous Latin slip, taking the fors of fors fortuna as if it were from fortis, brave fortune. So it's in this text that Plutarch argues most substantially for the idea of a providential view of history. And in the course of his history, of this text, Plutarch takes numerous chances where fortune seemed to the dice seemed to fall happily for the Romans. So, for example, the famous story of the geese on the Capitol. So Rome's survival depended on chance, but not arbitrary chance, but rather the planning of the gods, the divine planning of the gods. Now, I think Plutarch's On the Fortune of the Romans is best read as a response to texts like Metrodorus's, these now lost earlier texts that argued that the rise of Rome was due to mere chance, anti-Roman histories. Plutarch takes these on, twists them around to a more pro-Roman narrative. So the answer of Plutarch is that fortune indeed was behind the rise of Rome, but now a different kind of fortune, a providential kind of fortune. So, to summarize, in the court of Mithridates of Pontus, Metrodorus of Skepsis composed an anti-Roman account of Rome's rise to dominance. It was probably presented in the form of a rhetorical agone between virtue and fortune, of the kind showcased by Plutarch's speeches. The emphasis on forensic accusation runs through all of the sources, and of course Metrodorus was himself a rhetorician and lawyer. My hunch is that virtue appeared personified, speaking on behalf of the Greeks, and particularly Alexander, in accusation of the Romans and fortune. The argument that virtue will have put forward will have run something like this. The Romans have always lacked virtue thanks to their low-class origins. We can look to Romulus's asylum for evidence that they took in anyone. Secondly, the Romans got lucky at every crucial juncture in their history. So, for example, the story of Manilius and the Capitoline geese. In particular, they got lucky when Alexander decided to head east first rather than west, and when he died young. Next, Alexander was virtuous rather than fortunate. If he had confronted the Romans, he would have defeated them. Rome, by contrast, rose after Alexander's death when there were no real competitors. That said, what this story shows us is that empire is impermanent and that Rome can be defeated in the future, whether by the Pontic court of the Pontic soldiers of Mithridates or by anyone else. And finally, most importantly perhaps, history is aleatory rather than providential. The good guys don't always win. So, I submit, there certainly were intellectuals writing against Roman imperialism, and almost certainly, I would say, in the court of Mithridates and Pontus. Whether they were writing exactly the kind of material I've sketched out is less certain, but I turn that over to you for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim, for this great talk about chance and resistance. It was made perfectly clear to me that we have to use these things.
I think there was one very famous source which is missing on your handout, the famous letter of Mithridates from Sallust's Histories, which where many topoi of anti-Roman opinions are discussed. Would you say that, or is it possible that this passage from Sallust's Histories, that letter of Mithridates, is a kind of a secondary source for Mithridates?
That's a very interesting proposition. Yes, you're absolutely right. I should have mentioned that. I will have to go back and look at it and see if I can trace any parallels. But yeah, it's a very suggestive idea. Thank you very much for that.
I wondered if you could say a bit more about this ambivalence of Tucher or fortune, because it went a bit fast towards the end of your talk. Are you saying that in Plutarch, a fortune adopts the providential meaning, that it is a luck, it's a good fortune, but it's somehow a providential force rather than sheer arbitrariness? In what kind of terms is that distinction articulated in the actual texts? Because the term is the same, isn't it? It's Tucher, and Tucher plays an enormous role in, as you mentioned, in Polybius and in other historians as an explanatory factor. And then suddenly here it adopts almost the opposite meaning. And how do you justify that interpretation?
Well, how do I justify that? In terms of, could I have a look at the handout? Sorry.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Well, I justify it with reference to that final passage, which what Plutarch means here is that when Tucher approached the Palatine and crossed the Tiber, she took off the wings are symbols of instability. Okay, she stepped out of her sandals, which again are symbols of the transitory nature of Tucher, that she goes from place to place. And she abandoned this apiston kai palimbolon sphiran. Okay, so I mean Plutarch there's no ambiguity about it in Plutarch. Before Rome came along, Tucher meant the instability, the unstable world of happenstance, and then after Rome comes along, she acquires this other meaning, this thoroughly providential meaning. Now, how Plutarch would justify this theologically, whether he would say that somehow there was a shift in the heavens, or whether the gods changed their nature somehow, I don't know. This is usually thought to be an early and rhetorical piece of Plutarch. It doesn't have quite the same developed theology of the later Plutarch. So I think we need to take it this passage on its own terms, rather than trying to mine it too deeply for providential theology. Is that answering your question?
But is Plutarch alone in taking this view of Tucher, or are there any parallels?
Well, I don't know any parallels it's exceptionally interesting, I think, that he locates this ambiguity. I don't think there are many instances of Greek writers saying this word can mean, and particularly a word like Tucher, such an important word, can mean two different things. I mean, of course, in modern languages we do separate out the concepts, but in Greek they folded them together, and this is, a very useful slippage for people like Polybius, who can work with the flexibility and ambiguity of the term. But Plutarch very clearly separates them out. Now, as I say, I don't know of any parallels for other ancient writers. I mean, certainly not separating them out in this way, that's to say, saying that the advent of Rome makes a difference. But you can find in Menander, for example, Tucher delivers the delayed preface in the Aspis, the very important passage in which she seems to imply that she is now controlling the plot providentially and she will script a happy ending at the end. That intervention of Tucher, you could say, is intervening in the aleatory processes of the plot. The characters think that they're in a world which is very confused and uncertain, and then Tucher comes on stage and says, "Don't worry, I'm Tucher, I will make sure that there's a happy ending here." The Greek novels play similarly with, if you like, split perceptions of the nature of the world. You have one set of people who believe that they're in an arbitrary world governed by malign forces, and another set of people who believe that they are in a providentially governed world that will take you through to the end. So I think this distinction, this broad distinction between randomness and providence is a widespread distinction, but I think only Plutarch focuses in semantically on the ambiguity of Tucher, and certainly only Plutarch connects that ambiguity to Rome itself, as far as I know.
But I think you said that this would be to be understood as a response or a criticism of the view of Metrodorus and the like, that the as it were, the sequence of events that led to the dominance of Rome was entirely due to chance.
Yes.
So, I mean, how clever is it for an author to make such a rather unprecedented move in the semantics of a term to address such a to express such a criticism?
Well, it's I think what Plutarch is criticising is the kind of argument that Metrodorus proposed, as you say, not criticising Rome. What he's doing is he's answering the critics of Rome using a very dangerous strategy of argumentation. So it's what we call in English brinkmanship, which is, when when you play poker for high stakes, as it were, you raise the stakes very high and you manage to get away with it. I do think it's clever in a rhetorical sense. I think a lot of imperial rhetoric is like this. It takes on dangerous, difficult, edgy themes and toys with the idea that you might be about to say something deeply offensive and pulls back and turns it around and makes it so that it's acceptable. I think that's exactly what's going on here. It is a very potentially difficult and dangerous claim that he's making here, but as I say, he turns it around with this redefinition of Tucher and makes it just about acceptable. He just about gets away with it. So dancing with the devil is an enjoyable game for rhetoricians.
I believe Claudia was next.
I'd like to thank you for your inspiring talk, and I'd like to start my question with late antiquity. When you see Augustine's The City of God, you see that in the first half of his book he really desperately tries to, let's say, to secularize Roman history. So the consequence is that this notion of the divine providence being the, let's say, the basis of all the Roman successes is very predominant at this time. Yeah? And my question is, if I would like to bridge the gap between, let's say, Metrodorus and Augustine, are there any strong voices like Metrodorus in imperial times, or is it rather the ambiguity of Plutarch, or the more positive like Aelius Aristides being the standard in imperial times?
Yeah, very difficult question. I think you're absolutely right that the providentialism of Roman imperial historical accounts is taken over by the Christians. I mean, Eusebius is another very good example of a kind of providential form of, church history now, but anchored to a view of divine favour. And of course, the Christians get it from Jewish historiography as well, and the Hebrew Bible. But your more substantial question was about whether there is anything bridging the two. I've searched for it. It's hard to find. I can't find anything in. I mean, I would need to go back and look more thoroughly at Herodian and Cassius Dio, but I have looked through them and I can't find anything there that suggests a opposition of these kinds. To me, the most suggestive thing here is the opposition between providence and randomness looks as if it's an opposition between Stoicism and Epicureanism. So it would be really intriguing to know if there were Epicureans who write history based on the idea that everything happens through chance and that there are no gods intervening in things. I haven't yet, and I haven't been systematic about this, but I haven't yet found any evidence whatsoever for Epicureans writing history of that kind. It would be really wonderful to find it, but unfortunately I haven't located it yet.
Well, you already answered a part of my question. It concerns Cassius Dio, because I mean he is a Greek historiographer, and he writes Roman history in Greek language. And as much as I can remember my readings of Cassius Dio, he never there's not a hint of criticism of Roman imperialism or things like that, but he has completely the view of the Roman the Roman perspective on the world, and the Greeks are the environment of Rome. Now Cassius Dio was writing in the beginning of the 3rd century, and he's of course he's got the Civitas Romana, and he was even consul in Rome. Yeah. Now my question is, which is a typical historical question, is it the difference or the Greek view of Roman success? Is it depending on the historical situation on the one hand side, the early imperial history or later imperial history? And then also, is it a question of the social setting of the writer? Like, I mean, Cassius Dio belongs to the Greek upper classes, or how we want to call them, and who were integrated in the Roman senatorial society in that time. So can you also, about Methodorus of Skepsis, are there any hints about his social situation and his settings, so to say?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think the principle underlying that is absolutely right, and I think I'd go even further. I would say that people like myself who've studied and written a lot on Greek literature and the Roman Empire, Greek culture and the Roman Empire, have got very distracted by a sort of nationalist version of what Greek culture was like. It's very easy to get distracted by that when you have people like Livy saying "Levistimi ex Graecis" and so forth. But in fact, actually, I don't think Greekness itself determines the response that one has to Rome. Part of the reason why you've been misled by all of this is Erwin Roeder, who in his book on the Greek novel coined this phrase, the second sophistic. He coined it, he borrowed it from Philostratus, but coined it for the modern era. And he defined it very much in terms of Greek resistance to, on the one hand, Rome, and on the other hand, the religions of the Orient. So we are still imprisoned, in a sense, by those kinds of Rhodian walls, as it were, and we're inclined very much to see Greek nationalism everywhere, and I really don't think that's the way that it operates. Now, Metrodorus, yes, he was a high-class individual. He was Greek, but I think in retrospect, perhaps I should have put more emphasis on the fact that that this perspective that he's coming out with here is, I mean, if I've reconstructed it correctly, is a Pontic perspective, really. I mean, it's all about the location of the court of Mithridates. It's all about a military rival, imperial rival to Rome's power. It's not anything to do with ethnic consciousness. It may have an ethnic component to it, so that material in Dionysius about the Greeks being superior to the Romans in terms of virtue has an ethnic dimension to it, but I don't think there's anything like the nationalisms that are bedeviling modern Europe working here. I think it's much more, as you say, to do with local circumstances and political needs and socio-economic location.
Any more questions about chance, resistance, and things like that? If not, maybe I can briefly ask about real resistance. I mean, of course, in literature, so I wondered about these historians. This seems a rather academic affair. I mean, you talk about Arete versus Tücher and so forth, but I just wanted to ask about literature such as Revelation and Sibyllinic oracles, and so something, I mean, it's still kind of allegorical, and of course it's not nearly anything as philosophical as Metrodorus of Skepsis and so forth. But would you agree that this is we talked about class, so is this a lower class thing within the Greek cosmos, or is this really a marginal phenomenon in the East or the West, in Rome or Palestine and so forth, or is it just the man on the streets who reads the Oracle of the Potter, so to speak, an actualization, Oracle of the Potter Reloaded, something like this. So do these guys have anything to do with these academics? I mean, metaphorically speaking, like Metrodorus and so forth?
Yeah, clearly it's very difficult to judge the level at which Metrodorus's writings would have come out. I mean, they must have had a certain amount of currency if they were reaching Rome, and if they were 70 or so years after Metrodorus's death, if they were still in circulation, they must have had, and they must also have gone to an extent under the elite radar, because we have no other references other than the ones I've given you on the handout to Metrodorus's writings. So, well, we have a few actually. There are Jacobi has some references to other texts, but they must have been in circulation. But that apart, yes, okay, so what about the social status of a text like the Sibylline oracles? Well, it's not unsophisticated, is it? I mean, they're crammed with references to Homer. It's written in fairly ambitious hexameter Greek in the Ionic dialect. So it's participating in the epic tradition. I don't know. I think we as scholars do tend to like to locate things on social maps, and we do talk often about the elite and, you know, the notablo or whatever, but I suspect people in antiquity didn't stay in their boxes quite as easily as we would like them to have done, and especially when you're talking about resistance literature. I mean, there's no reason why a text composed in one particular social milieu might not have been read and received in another social milieu. Presumably we are to think of resistance literature as circulating in a kind of samizdat way. It circulates amongst people that want to read it, people that know somebody who knows somebody and so forth. So I don't think that we need to necessarily think of it as in the same way that, you know, we tend to think of, I don't know, Lucian or Plutarch as a pepaidumenos who's sort of fixed in that class and only talks to other pepaidumenoi. The whole point of this material, I suppose, is to circulate.
Okay, great. Yeah, Herr Hinsch.
I just wanted to ask again where the resistance is, because there's malicious talk, and there's someone writing for a barbarian king and telling him what he wants to hear. But is this resistance? This is just different views on history or different ways to sneer your opponent, but isn't resistance something else in terms of literature? Isn't it something like a subculture which is within the same society, which articulates different views, like post-colonialism or anything like that?
Okay, so you're objecting to the fact that this guy is not he's not a punk, you know. He's not sort of a member of the youth who's sort of railing against the status quo. He is actually an elite person in the court of a foreign king. So you might say it's not resistance any more than, I don't know, one of Putin's ministers of information or whatever being resisting the Roman Empire, American Empire, whatever we want to call it. British Empire. Yes, I mean, no, I take your point there, but I think my point in this paper was really not to describe resistance as a subcultural form, but to try to find alternative histories of Rome that told the story in a way that countered the dominant narrative of Roman imperialism. Is that resistance? In the simplest sense, it is, with a small r. Maybe you're right, maybe that one needs to nuance it a little bit more and think about what resistance, the connotations of resistance in the modern world a bit more. So, yeah, thank you for that.
I'm interested if the Greeks really thought that their freedom could be restored. For example, Nero granted the freedom to the Greeks, which Vespasian cancelled again. And I see that there were circulating several treaties which treat the former freedom from the Greeks in the imperial times. Do you think that the Greeks, and this could be some kind of resistance, that they thought that this freedom could be restored?
Well, thank you for that, Frank. It's another really interesting question, and of course, in a way, this intersects with the Roman discourse of libertas, which has been well studied, and the scholars studying it have shown that it's a very multivalent term, and it can mean different things depending on where you're coming from. I don't know of any study, maybe you're doing it yourself, I don't know of any study on different uses of the language of eleutheros, what it means to set people free. It's clearly not a straightforward concept. Again, even with Nero's liberation of Greece, what in practice did that mean? I mean, I'm no expert on this. You are, okay.
Cassius Dio says something about this occasion at Nero. He says that it is only a fiscal thing. Yeah? Achaia produced so less fiscal input to the Roman Empire, yeah, that it does not matter whether they pay the taxes or not. But I think the Greeks did not understand it in the fiscal way, but in political. That's the point.
Right, yes. But when you say the Greeks, I mean, there were many Greeks, aren't there?
There are sources, for example, in the Vita of Apollonius from Tyana and several epistles, and also in Plutarch, there are several occasions where he says in De Sera Numinis Vindicata, Nero was a terrible soul, but this one point, he granted the freedom to the Greeks again, this would rescue his soul.
But yes, and these are all later sources, aren't they? I mean, particularly the Apollonius passage is very, I mean, exactly the kind of playing around with the question of what it is to be eleutheros is going on there. So Apollonius has a different kind of freedom. He has spiritual freedom and so forth. And when they discuss that political freedom, it's trading with trading ideas, of different ideas of what it is to be free. Yes, so I suppose one question is what Greeks at the time made of it, and we simply don't know, I guess, what they made of that freedom. Plutarch's writing a little bit later. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a very, very interesting question. I'll have to think about that. Thanks.
Sorry again, I did not understand your last thing.
I said I'll have to think about it more. I'll have to go and look at the sources more because
okay,
I'm not I don't have all the sources in my head really for what freedom. I mean, I'm sure you're absolutely right that it was primarily interpreted in political terms, but whether it was interpreted by people at the time in political terms or whether that was a kind of misunderstanding, a kind of utopian retrospective misunderstanding created out of this sort of weird idealization of Nero that appears in some traditions, I don't know.
The point is that the Greek freedom was ever since the Persian Wars an integral part of the Greek identity. And there had been much research on the Greek identity in times of Second Sophistic. And what I see is that this speaking about political freedom by the Greeks was ever neglected in the research. So I would guess there have to be some research much more on this field, I guess.
Yeah,
that's only a remark.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that Dionysius passage that I quoted at the beginning also refers to the opposition between free and slave in this case, and says that, the Romans were originally slaves and, the Greeks are free and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, it's clearly a very powerful emotive term that can be used in all sorts of different ways.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, then, maybe we can thank Tim again for this great talk. And we'll certainly continue discussion about resistance, Roman rule, freedom, and all these things over 1 or 3 glasses of wine, perhaps. And yeah, please join us for the reception. Thank you very much.